The hum of the environmental controls was the loudest sound in my lab, a constant, low thrum that blended into the background of my existence. It was a familiar, almost comforting melody in the otherwise silent expanse of the state-of-the-art forensic center, everything sterile and cold. My world was one of bone fragments, soil samples, and the quiet narratives they whispered. I preferred it that way. Living among the echoes of the long gone was far less complicated than navigating the convoluted demands of the living. My hands, usually steady and precise, traced the faint lines on a centuries-old femur, a relic from a forgotten skirmish unearthed during a routine construction project. Each ridge, each scar, told a story of hardship, of violence, of a life brutally cut short. This was my sanctuary, a place where time bent to my will, where the dead spoke only to me. Then the sharp, insistent chirp of my desk phone ripped through the quiet. I flinched, my concentration shattering like brittle glass. It wasn't just any phone, it was the dedicated line, the one reserved for urgent calls, the kind that meant something significant had been pulled from the earth, or worse, left on it. I hesitated, my gaze lingering on the femur. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to dive back into the comforting certainty of established history. But the other part, the insatiable part, the one that thrived on puzzles, knew I couldn't. I picked up. "Reid," I stated, my voice a little rougher than I intended, a consequence of disuse. "Reid, it's the lead detective from the regional unit." The voice on the other end crackled, already sounding strained. "We have something unusual. You're going to want to see this. Remote site, deep bog country northwest. Looks like, well, it looks like a bog man." A bog man. The words hung in the air, potent and electrifying. My grip tightened on the receiver. This wasn't a femur from a forgotten skirmish. This was something else entirely. Bog bodies, perfectly preserved by the unique anaerobic conditions of peat bogs, were rare archaeological treasures, windows into ancient worlds. The thought sent a prickle of anticipation down my spine, a sensation I rarely experienced. It was the kind of discovery that made headlines redefined history. "Details," I commanded, pushing aside the faint resentment at the interruption. My mind was already shifting gears, calculating logistics, envisioning the preservation challenges. Found by a land surveyor mapping for a new wind farm. Thought it was a tree root at first, then saw, well, skin and hair. The archaeological department is already buzzing, but the local constabulary insisted you be contacted. They're being cautious. Too cautious, if you ask me. It's clearly ancient. The detective's tone was dismissive, almost annoyed by the bureaucratic delay. I ignored his skepticism. "Send me the coordinates. I'll pack the field kit. How soon can I be there?" "We'll have a transport ready in an hour. It's a rough drive once I hit the main track, then a short hike in. We've secured the site, minimal disturbance, just as I always insist." There was a grudging respect in his voice now, or perhaps just weariness. He knew my protocols. He knew I wouldn't tolerate anything less than meticulous preservation. It was pregnant with possibility. My internal clock, usually set to the slow rhythm of decay, accelerated. A bog man. The chance to examine a specimen so perfectly preserved, so untouched by the ravages of time, was a career-defining event. It was the kind of discovery that fueled my passion, that reminded me why I had chosen this solitary path. Within minutes, I was moving, my movements efficient and practiced. I pulled out my specialized field kit, sterile tools, sample containers, preservation solutions, high-resolution cameras, laser scanners. Each item was meticulously organized, ready for any eventuality. My mind raced, constructing preliminary hypotheses. What period could it be from? What could its discovery tell us about ancient rituals, daily life, or even early forms of violence? The historical community would be in a frenzy. The journey was as described. A jarring ride in a sturdy, government-issued vehicle, the paved roads quickly giving way to gravel, then to a barely-there track that snaked through increasingly dense, damp woodland. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The driver, a taciturn officer, kept his eyes on the winding path, offering only curt responses to my questions about the local terrain. Finally, the vehicle lurched to a halt at the edge of a vast, desolate expanse. The sky was a bruised purple, heavy with unspoken rain. This was it. The bog. A small cluster of official vehicles, their emergency lights flashing a muted orange against the twilight, marked the site. A few figures, bundled in heavy coats, milled about, their voices hushed, almost reverent. As I stepped out, the ground beneath my feet felt spongy, alive. The lead detective, a burly man with a perpetually furrowed brow, met me at the edge of the cordoned-off area. "Reid, thanks for coming, it's quite something." His usual cynicism was replaced by an uncharacteristic awe. He gestured towards a shallow excavation pit, carefully lined with tarpaulins to prevent further erosion. A makeshift canopy had been erected overhead, shielding the discovery from the elements. As I approached, my breath caught in my throat. There it lay. Its skin, remarkably intact, was the color of aged mahogany. Hair, a reddish-brown tangle, still clung to its scalp. It wasn't just a skeleton, it was a ghost, perfectly preserved, reaching out from an unimaginable past. The sight was breathtaking. My forensic anthropologist's brain immediately began cataloging, assessing. The way the limbs were positioned, the texture of the visible skin, the faint outline of what appeared to be ancient garments clinging to the form. It was a marvel, an archaeological dream. "We haven't touched anything beyond what was necessary to stabilize the immediate area," the detective murmured, his voice low. "The archaeologists are chomping at the bit, but I told them to wait for I read the expert on. Well, on what happens to bodies." I nodded, my eyes fixed on the figure. The preservation was extraordinary, almost too good. The details were so crisp, so defined, that for a fleeting, unsettling moment, I felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the biting wind. It was a feeling that something wasn't quite right, a discordant note in an otherwise perfect symphony. But I pushed it down. It was probably just the sheer novelty, the overwhelming significance of the find. This was, without a doubt, a glimpse into history, or so it seemed. The transfer from the bog was a delicate, painstaking operation. Each layer of peat meticulously documented before the body itself was encased in a specially designed support and airlifted. I rode in silence, the roar of the rotors a dull thrum against my skull, my gaze fixed on the secured form. The lead archaeologist, a wiry man whose enthusiasm bordered on manic, chattered incessantly about the historical significance, the unprecedented preservation, the grants, the publications. I nodded, offering non-committal hums, my mind already dissecting, observing, cataloging. When we finally arrived at the state-of-the-art forensic center, everything sterile and cold, the transition was jarring. The gleaming steel surfaces, the fluorescent lights, the hushed efficiency of the staff, it was a world away from the ancient, wind-whipped expanse where the body had rested for centuries. Or so they believed. I suited up, pulling on scrubs, a mask, and double gloves, feeling the familiar weight of anticipation mixed with that persistent, unsettling doubt. A team of junior technicians stood by, eager, hushed, awaiting my instructions. The lead archaeologist hovered at the edge of the room behind the glass partition, his camera ready. Even the lead detective, a man whose patience was as thin as his graying hair, watched from a distance, a notepad clutched in his hand. "Initial assessment," I murmured, more to myself than to the room, my voice muffled by the mask. I leaned closer, a magnifying visor already flipped down over my eyes. "No direct contact until I say so. We'll start with external observation and photography, macro and micro." The first few hours were a dance of careful exposure. I used small, soft brushes, dental picks, and a gentle stream of distilled water to carefully remove the adhering peat, millimeter by painstaking millimeter. The textile preservation alone. I ignored him, my focus absolute. Every detail was a clue, every texture a chapter in a story. The preservation truly was extraordinary, too extraordinary. That discordant note first felt in the bog resonated again. I examined the skin. The peat had chemically tanned it, turning it into a leathery hide, but the texture felt uniform, almost too uniform. Ancient bog bodies often showed areas of more significant desiccation, subtle variations in the tanning process depending on the depth and composition of the peat. Here, the effect was remarkably consistent across the exposed surfaces. I moved to the hair. It was matted, yes, and stained the typical reddish-brown hue of bog finds. But as I carefully separated a few strands near the scalp, I noticed something. The roots, usually the most vulnerable part, showed a surprising lack of degradation compared to the rest of the strand. And the cut ends. They were clean, almost sharp, as if recently trimmed rather than frayed and degraded by millennia. Hold that, I instructed a technician, pointing to a specific area of the scalp. Get a high-resolution image of the hair roots and then a cross-section sample. Immediately. My eyes scanned the body again, searching for any signs of trauma, any indication of how this individual had met their end. Bog bodies often bore evidence of violent death, ritual sacrifice, murder, execution. This one, however, seemed peaceful, almost serene. No obvious stab wounds, no crushed skull, no rope marks on the neck. But the apparent lack of trauma itself could be a clue or a deception. I moved to the clothing. The wool tunic and leather belt were astonishing. I gently probed the weave of the wool with a fine probe. The fibers were intact, their structure clearly visible under magnification. But a tiny, almost imperceptible glint caught my eye near the hem of the tunic. I leaned in closer, holding my breath. It was a single-minute metallic thread woven into the fabric. Silver. No, too bright, too reflective, I couldn't place it. A prehistoric textile wouldn't have a metallic thread like that, would it? I felt a prickle of unease. Zoom in on this area, I told a technician, pointing with a gloved finger. High magnification. Get me a spectral analysis of that thread. I want to know its composition. The technician nodded, her brow furrowed slightly as she adjusted the camera. I could feel the lead archaeologist's gaze burning into my back through the glass, probably wondering why I was focusing on such minutiae instead of celebrating the grand discovery. I started to doubt myself. Was I seeing things? There was the strain of the discovery, the pressure, making me imagine anomalies where none existed. Bog bodies were rare, and each one presented its own unique characteristics. Perhaps this was simply an exceptionally well-preserved example, with unusual features I hadn't encountered before. I gently ran my gloved hand over the preserved skin of the forearm. It was cool, pliable, but lacked the distinct, earthy aroma of true bog peat that permeated the rest of the body's surroundings. Instead, there was a faint, almost imperceptible scent beneath the surface, something vaguely chemical, like a faint preservative or a cleaning agent. I closed my eyes, inhaling deeply, trying to isolate it. It was so subtle, so easily dismissed, but it was there. Is the air filtration system on full? I asked, my voice sharper than intended. A technician looked up, startled. Yes, Reid, always. Then it wasn't the lab air, it was the body. The initial archaeological marvel was slowly, painstakingly, morphing into something else under my scrutiny. The pieces didn't quite fit. The perfectly preserved hair roots, the unusual metallic thread, the faint chemical scent, the eerily uniform skin tanning. Each detail on its own could be dismissed as an anomaly, but together they began to form a dissonant chord, a symphony of not quite right. My doubt was no longer about my own perception, it was about the body itself. This wasn't just an ancient find. This was something far more intricate, far more deliberate, and my determination, initially focused on scientific documentation, now sharpened into something else entirely, a relentless pursuit of the truth, whatever it might be. I had a feeling that the true story of this body was only just beginning to unfold. The cool, sterile air of the state-of-the-art forensic center, everything sterile and cold, offered no comfort. It merely amplified the silence, broken only by the hum of ventilation and the soft click of my instruments. I leaned closer to the illuminated examination table, my breath fogging the clear shield for a moment before dissipating. The body, once a source of archaeological wonder, now felt like a meticulously crafted puzzle, each piece screaming a silent contradiction. The initial reports had been effusive, unprecedented preservation, a window into ancient times. I'd bought into it initially. Who wouldn't? But the closer I looked, the more the narrative fractured. My gloved fingertips traced the hairline. Bog preservation, even the best, usually involved some degree of cellular degradation at the follicular level over millennia. These roots looked almost recently nourished. I pulled a single strand, examined it under a low-power microscope. No signs of stress from ancient burial, no telltale crystalline structures. Instead, I saw a faint, almost iridescent metallic thread, barely thicker than a spider's silk, woven into a few of the deeper strands near the occipital bone. It wasn't organic. It didn't belong. My brow furrowed. What was this? Then there was the scent. I'd initially dismissed it as a lingering bog aroma, but here, in the controlled environment, it was distinct. A faint, cloying chemical scent, almost almond-like, subtly overlaying the earthy peat. It wasn't the scent of natural anaerobic decay, but something more artificial, something designed to stop decay, and the skin. Uniform, unnaturally so. Bog bodies often presented with varied textures, some areas more preserved than others depending on contact with peat acids or exposure to water currents. This body's skin tone, a deep reddish brown, was consistent from the tips of the fingers to the soles of the feet, a perfect, even tan that seemed too deliberate. It was as if the entire surface had been treated simultaneously, thoroughly. I stepped back, running a hand over my close-cropped hair. Was I overthinking this? Was my brain conditioned to seek out anomalies, creating them where none existed? The archaeologists had been so certain, so thrilled. The local authorities, too, had been eager to label it an ancient find, a historical curiosity rather than a modern crime scene. The media had already run with the Bog Man of the Fen headlines. To contradict them now felt almost sacrilegious, but the evidence, however subtle, gnawed at me. It didn't fit. It just didn't. The next morning, the conference room felt like a tribunal. A panel of archaeologists, their faces etched with anticipation and a touch of proprietary pride, sat opposite me. Beside them, the lead detective, a man with a perpetually skeptical squint, and a representative from the local district office, radiating bureaucratic impatience. Beyond them, a few journalists, their recorders already running, eyes bright with the promise of a sensational story. I stood at the projector, the images of the perfectly preserved body filling the screen behind me. The initial findings are, indeed, remarkable. I began, my voice calm even despite the knot in my stomach. The anaerobic environment of the bog certainly contributed to an extraordinary level of preservation, far exceeding many comparable finds globally. I let that sink in, giving them their moment of triumph. Then I shifted. However, my detailed forensic analysis has uncovered some interesting discrepancies. I clicked to the next slide, a magnified image of the hair roots. While the hair itself appears perfectly preserved, the follicular structure exhibits an integrity that is unusual for remains of such purported antiquity. There's a distinct lack of the cellular breakdown one would expect after millennia. A senior archaeologist, a woman with tight, silver hair and an air of academic authority, leaned forward. "Nonsense, Reid. We've seen varying degrees of preservation. This is simply an exceptional case." I held up a small, sealed bag containing the metallic thread. And this, a fine, almost iridescent metallic thread woven into the deepest layers of the scalp hair. Microscopic analysis suggests it's a synthetic polymer, possibly with a metal-infused coating, not something we'd expect in Iron Age textiles, let alone naturally occurring in hair. The room buzzed. The journalists scribbled furiously. The lead detective simply crossed his arms, his skepticism deepening. Furthermore, I continued undeterred. The uniform preservation of the skin, while visually impressive, raises questions. Natural bog preservation often results in differential tanning and texture. Here, we see a remarkably consistent chemical treatment across the entire epidermal surface, and the faint, almond-like chemical scent, which some initially attributed to the bog, is in fact a persistent residue of a modern embalming or preservation agent. I displayed spectral analysis graphs, abstract lines that meant nothing to most but spoke volumes to me. This isn't natural bog chemistry. Are you suggesting it's not ancient? The district representative blurted out, his face paling. The historical sensation, the tourism boom, the grants all threatened. I am suggesting, I corrected, my gaze sweeping across the room, that this body, while appearing ancient, bears subtle but significant markers of modern intervention. Someone went to extraordinary lengths to make this body appear as an ancient bog find. I clicked to my final slide, a composite image highlighting the anomalies. This points not to an archaeological discovery, to a meticulously staged crime scene. A wave of protests erupted. Preposterous. You're ruining a historical marvel. A staged murder, that's quite a leap, Reid. The lead detective finally spoke, his voice gravelly. Reid, what you're suggesting, that's a lot of resources, a lot of manpower for something that might just be an unusual bog body. Are you absolutely certain? I met his gaze. I am certain enough to demand further, more extensive forensic tests. Radiocarbon dating, yes, but also advanced trace evidence analysis on the clothing fibers, comprehensive chemical profiling of the preservation agent, and full genomic sequencing of the hair and tissue samples. We need to ascertain the true age of these remains and the precise nature of how they came to be so perfectly preserved. The archaeologists exchanged exasperated glances. The district representative looked like he'd swallowed a lemon. The media were in a frenzy, sensing a much juicier story than a simple ancient find. I felt a surge of frustration, but also a deep resolve. They could doubt me, they could resist, but the evidence, however quiet, was screaming. The meticulousness, the sheer effort to erase identity and rewrite history. This wasn't just a body in a bog. This was a message painstakingly crafted, and I was going to read every single word. But they couldn't stop me from finding the truth. My conviction hardened like set concrete. This wasn't some ancient relic. This was a crime scene, and I was going to prove it. The transition from the wild, ancient bog to the controlled environment of the state-of-the-art forensic center, everything sterile and cold, was jarring. The air, thick with the scent of damp earth and peat just hours ago, was now a sharp, metallic tang of disinfectant and ozone. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a stark, shadowless glow on every surface. The body, still encased in its protective block of peat, lay on a reinforced steel table. The archaeologists had insisted on its integrity, treating it as a fragile artifact. I saw it as evidence, a silent witness screaming for justice. A junior colleague, a quiet sort with an earnest gaze, stood by, already preparing the specialized tools. "Ready when you are, Reid," they murmured, their voice hushed as if in a cathedral. I nodded, pulling on a fresh pair of gloves. "Let's start with the surface meticulously. I want microscopic samples from every crevice, every fold of clothing, and be gentle with the peat. It's a gold mine." My hands, usually precise, felt a tremble of anticipation. This was where the real work began, away from the skeptical eyes and the clamor of the media. Here, under the unforgiving lights, the truth would be laid bare. I began with the outer layer of peat, carefully shaving away thin sheets with a specialized scalpel, collecting the shavings into labeled containers. It was a slow, painstaking process, like peeling back layers of time itself. The organic material, so dense and protective, yielded grudgingly. As I worked, my gaze swept over the exposed areas of the body. It was astonishing, truly. For a moment, a sliver of doubt crept in. Had I truly misjudged? Could this be ancient? The preservation was so perfect. My mind wrestled with the possibility, replaying the subtle anomalies from the bog side, the peculiar tightness of the woven fibers, the faint, almost imperceptible sheen on a fingernail. No, my gut churned with certainty. There was something wrong. Begin with the hair samples, I instructed the colleague, pointing to the matted strands clinging to the scalp. And then the nails. We need comprehensive toxicology, microanalysis of every fiber. Hours blurred into a methodical dance of instruments and observation. I moved to the teeth, a critical area for identification. The bog's acidity had eroded much of the enamel, but the underlying dentin was surprisingly intact in places. I used a high magnification microscope, adjusting the focus with minute precision, and then I saw it. It wasn't the dull, natural sheen of ancient bone or dentin. It was a faint metallic sparkle. My breath hitched. I leaned closer, adjusting the light. It was a filling, a small, expertly placed dental restoration, but it wasn't gold, nor was it the crude lead or tin alloys sometimes found in ancient dentistry. This was too uniform, too smooth. The colleague adjusted the microscope settings, bringing the image onto a large display screen. The tiny speck expanded, revealing its true nature. It was a modern composite resin, a photopolymerized filling material, the kind used by dentists today. Its specific hue and translucent quality were unmistakable. It was impossible for it to have survived thousands of years in a bog without degradation, let alone be thousands of years old. This wasn't just an anomaly, it was a screaming anachronism. My initial suspicion, the one that had been met with such resistance, was not only confirmed but amplified. The preservation wasn't merely astonishing. It was too good for the context, a calculated deception. "Get me the elemental analysis on this immediately," I said, my voice firmer now, the last vestiges of doubt eradicated. "And I want a full dental scan, every tooth, every surface." As the colleague rushed to comply, I continued my examination, spurred by the discovery. My fingers, now imbued with renewed purpose, traced the coarse, woven fabric that still clung to the body. It looked like ancient wool, but the weave felt different, too regular, too perfect. Under the microscope, a single, almost invisible fiber detached itself. It was thin, unnaturally uniform, and possessed a subtle sheen. I carefully transferred it to a slide. "And this," I announced, placing the slide under another microscope, "is a synthetic fiber, a polyester blend, if I'm not mistaken." The colleague peered into the eyepiece, their eyes widened. "The dye is also too stable, too vibrant for natural degradation over millennia." The room hummed with the quiet intensity of revelation. The pieces were locking into place with terrifying precision. A modern dental filling, a synthetic fiber, these weren't mere coincidences. They were deliberate, undeniable markers. This wasn't an ancient bog man. This was a carefully constructed tableau, a macabre mimicry of history designed to conceal a contemporary crime. I straightened up, taking a deep breath. I walked over to the secure phone line. "Get me the district representative," I said into the receiver, my voice clear and unwavering. "And the detective assigned to the initial bog discovery. Tell them to clear their schedules." The archaeological marvel had dissolved, replaced by the stark reality of modern murder. The tension in the room was palpable, a silent acknowledgement that the game had irrevocably changed. My mind raced, already piecing together the implications. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide this body, to stage this scene. And if they went to such lengths, they were cunning, ruthless, and dangerous. The ghosts of my own history, the ones that had stirred with the victim's fate, felt a little closer now, a little more insistent. The fight had truly begun. The air in the state-of-the-art forensic center, everything sterile and cold, still hummed with the echo of my pronouncement. Modern murder. It felt like a gauntlet thrown, and I, Reid, was more than ready to pick it up. The meticulous care taken to stage the scene in the bog, to disguise a contemporary crime as an ancient one, spoke of a cunning intelligence. That kind of challenge ignited something deep within me, a focus sharper than any surgical scalpel. My hands, usually precise and steady, now moved with an almost frantic energy, sifting through the digital scans of the victim's teeth. The preservation, initially a marvel, was now a crucial piece of the puzzle. Enamel, dentin, pulp, all perfectly intact, waiting to tell their story. The forensic odontologist, a quiet, intense woman with spectacles perched on her nose, worked beside me, her fingers flying across the keyboard, cross-referencing databases. It was a tedious process, one that often yielded nothing, but I had a gut feeling. Call it intuition, or perhaps the ghost of the bog still clinging to my senses. "There," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper, pointing at a glowing match on the screen. A full set of contemporary dental work. Implants, crowns, a very specific bonding pattern on the incisors. Not ancient, not even a century old. My gaze locked onto the image. The unique signature of modern dentistry. This wasn't just a match to a contemporary individual. It was a match to a specific name, a life. The screen flickered, pulling up a missing persons report filed 3 months prior. A photograph materialized. A woman, mid-40s, with shrewd, intelligent eyes and a determined set to her jaw. She's been missing since late autumn. The odontologist supplied, her finger tracing the details on the report. A prominent executive, head of a rapidly growing renewable energy firm, known for her fierce advocacy for environmental protection. The missing executive. The words hung in the sterile air, solidifying the transition from archaeological enigma to criminal investigation. New leads bloomed in my mind like moss after a rain. Corporate rivals, disgruntled employees, a jilted lover, the usual suspects for someone in her position. But the bog complicated everything. Why go to such elaborate lengths? I felt the familiar pull of the chase, the intellectual thrill of unraveling a complex knot. But as I read further, a detail on the missing persons report snagged my attention, tightening an invisible cord around my chest. Marital status, divorced, custody, sole guardian of a minor child. A child. The executive had left behind a child. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. It was a mirror, reflecting a past I tried to keep locked away. Not a child of my own, but one I had loved as fiercely as any parent. To see it reflected in this stranger's fate so precisely felt like a cruel twist of the knife. I cleared my throat, forcing the personal into the background. "We need to contact the detective assigned to her missing persons case immediately," I instructed, my voice sharper than I intended. "And I want every detail about her life, her business, her relationships, every single email, every phone record, every financial transaction." The detective arrived shortly after, a man with tired eyes and a perpetually rumpled suit. He listened to my findings with a grim, weary patience, occasionally running a hand through his thinning hair. "A missing executive," he repeated, shaking his head. We already leaned hard on her business partners, the rival firm, even her former assistant, a young man she'd recently fired. All dead ends. Solid alibis, no real motive beyond professional jealousy or petty revenge. "Tell me about them," I pressed, pushing the emotional resonance of the child to the back of my mind. I needed facts, not feelings. The rival executive, what was their relationship like? Cutthroat, the detective sighed, pulling out a notepad. The executive and the rival executive were locked in a bidding war for a massive government contract. Millions at stake, but the rival executive was out of the country, attending a conference in Geneva with dozens of witnesses. Landed back a day after the executive was reported missing. Too tight a window for abduction, murder, and bog dumping. I leaned back against a stainless steel counter, the cold metal seeping through my lab coat. And the former assistant. Troubled kid, drug issues. The executive had tried to help him, even paid for rehab once. But he relapsed, started stealing from petty cash. He had to let him go. He was angry, sure, made some threats, but nothing serious. He was picked up by patrol 3 days after she disappeared, found passed out in an abandoned warehouse across town. Hadn't left the building for days, according to the squatters he was with, hardly capable of orchestrating an elaborate murder staging. I frowned. It all sounded too neat, too easily dismissed. These were classic red herrings, designed to draw attention away from the true culprit. Or perhaps I was seeing patterns where none existed, blinded by the sheer audacity of the bog. Wait, that doesn't add up. The executive, known for her meticulous planning, her cautious nature, her dedication to her child, would she truly have put herself in a position to be abducted and murdered in such a remote, vulnerable way without a trace? It felt out of character, a dissonance that grated against my forensic instincts. What about her personal life? I asked, my gaze sweeping over the various screens displaying the executive's digital footprint. Any romantic entanglements, debts, enemies outside of business? The detective shrugged, clean as a whistle, devoted mother. Her social life revolved around her child and a small circle of close friends, mostly other single parents. No serious relationship since her divorce. Finances were sound, bordering on impressive. No outstanding debts, no shady dealings. He was, by all accounts, a model citizen. A model citizen meticulously preserved in a bog to mimic an ancient sacrifice. The pieces still refused to fit together seamlessly. The very lack of obvious motives, coupled with the elaborate staging, made my internal alarm bells ring louder. This wasn't a crime of passion or a simple business dispute gone wrong. And somewhere, hidden beneath layers of bog and deceit, was the truth. I just had to dig deeper, past the red herrings, past the echoes of my own pain until I found it. The game had indeed changed, and I was ready to play. The air in the state-of-the-art forensic center, everything sterile and cold, bit at my exposed skin, a stark contrast to the damp, earthy chill of the bog. Here, under the glare of focused halogen lamps, the body lay on the examination table, its ancient facade now stripped away by days of meticulous analysis. My fingers, encased in triple-layered gloves, traced the lines on the preserved skin, lines that had initially screamed centuries old but now whispered carefully orchestrated mimicry. I'd been working through the night, fueled by lukewarm coffee and a stubborn refusal to accept the obvious. The initial reports from the archaeological team, the historical community, even the preliminary assessment by the local investigators, they all pointed to an ancient find. But the gut feeling, that persistent, gnawing sensation that something was off, hadn't left me, and now I was starting to see why. Still at it, Reid, a colleague, a specialist in trace evidence, mumbled from across the room, more to the empty space than to me as he meticulously catalogued fibers under his own microscope. Still at it, I confirmed, my voice a low rumble, and I think I'm seeing the seams. The peat, that was the key. Everyone knew peat bogs were nature's ultimate preservation chambers, but this body, it was too perfect in some ways and subtly imperfect in others. The collagen fibers in the skin, for instance. They exhibited a uniform, almost artificial rigidity, not the gradual, uneven breakdown you'd expect over millennia, but a consistent, deep-seated alteration. I leaned closer, adjusting the magnification on the handheld digital scope. The hair, too, was a puzzle. While it had the characteristic reddish-brown hue of bog bodies, a result of the humic acids, the root structures showed an odd resilience, almost as if they'd been treated. Bring me the results from the humic acid spectrometry again. I instructed the assistant, a quiet individual who moved with practiced efficiency. Specifically, the concentration gradients within the epidermis versus the subcutaneous layers. She nodded, already moving towards the main console. I knew what I was looking for, a discrepancy. If the body had truly spent centuries submerged, the penetration of humic acids would be deep and uniform. But if it was a staged event, a forced preservation, there might be telltale variations. My mind raced, constructing scenarios. How would one artificially age a body to mimic bog preservation? It would require precise control over environmental factors, a deep understanding of organic chemistry, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. This wasn't a crude attempt. This was a masterpiece of deception. And that thought, the sheer audacity of it, sent a shiver down my spine, despite the clinical warmth of the room. The assistant returned, handing me a tablet displaying complex graphs. My eyes scanned the data, looking for the specific peaks and troughs, and there it was. A steeper gradient in the epidermal layers, a slower, less pervasive penetration deeper within the tissues. It indicated a shorter, albeit intense, exposure to a highly concentrated acidic solution, rather than the prolonged, gradual process of a natural bog burial. "They soaked him," I murmured, the words tasting like ash. "Not for centuries, but for weeks, maybe months, in a controlled environment." The colleague paused her work, her head cocked slightly. "Soaked him, like a pickling process." Essentially, I confirmed, my gaze fixed on the body. A hyper-accelerated bogging. They understood the mechanism and they replicated it, but not perfectly. The internal organs, while remarkably preserved, show a subtle difference in the degradation of certain lipids compared to genuine bog finds, and the bone density. That's the kicker. I moved to the skeletal scans displayed on a large screen nearby. The bones, while appearing aged on the surface, lacked the specific microfractures and leaching patterns associated with long-term submersion in acidic anaerobic conditions. There was a superficial brittleness, but the underlying structure was too robust, too modern. They couldn't age the bones as effectively as the soft tissue, I explained, gesturing at the screen. That takes a different kind of alchemy, a different kind of time, or perhaps they didn't have the time. A flicker of doubt crossed my mind. Was I seeing elaborate deception where a simpler explanation existed? Maybe this was just a particularly unusual natural bog find, a rare exception to the rules I'd spent my career studying. But the sum of the anomalies, the cumulative weight of the discrepancies, pushed back against that thought. No, this was deliberate. The killer hadn't just placed a body in a bog. They had prepared it. They had engineered its decay, or rather, its lack of decay, with a precision that bordered on scientific genius. This wasn't a random act, but some of the pollen grains. They are from species that are present in the bog, yes. They bloom in early spring, not late autumn when the body was supposedly placed. I turned to her, a new piece clicking into place. Meaning the body was exposed to those specific pollens at a different time of year, before it was placed in the bog. Or before it was fully submerged, she clarified, adjusting her glasses, as if it spent some time near the bog, not in it during early spring. Or, I mused, the puzzle pieces finally beginning to align, it was prepared elsewhere near those plants, then transported. And the final staging was done in late autumn to match the supposed discovery window. The implications were enormous. The killer had not only artificially aged the body, but had also meticulously controlled the environmental indicators on its surface. They had understood the forensic markers, the telltale signs, and had attempted to either eliminate them or introduce false ones. This wasn't just a murder, it was a performance. A carefully crafted narrative designed to mislead, to send everyone down an archaeological rabbit hole. And for a while, it had worked. My gaze returned to the body on the table, its preserved features now seeming less ancient and more like a mask. The victim's eyes, though sunken and discolored, held a silent challenge. "You almost missed it, didn't you?" The tension in the room thickened, a palpable weight pressing down on us. We were no longer investigating a historical enigma, but a modern, deeply calculated crime. This wasn't just about hiding a body. It was about creating a legend, a story that would forever obscure the truth. And I was determined to unravel every single thread of that meticulously woven lie. The sterile hum of the state-of-the-art forensic center, everything sterile and cold, had become the soundtrack to my life. It was a constant, low thrum against the frantic beat of my thoughts. The implications from our last discussion gnawed at me. A modern murder artfully disguised. The sheer audacity of it, the chilling precision. It spoke of an intelligence I both respected and feared. But intelligence, no matter how brilliant, always left a trace. It had to. I was back at my station, surrounded by the meticulously catalogued remnants of the bog victim. The body itself, having yielded its most immediate secrets, was now under deep preservation. My focus had shifted to the surrounding material, the peat, the ancient plant matter, the water samples, everything that had been collected from the immediate vicinity of the find. The forensic team had processed much of it, cataloging organic matter, identifying ancient pollen, but I had a hunch. The killer had been precise, but perhaps not omniscient. Hours blurred into a monotonous rhythm of pipettes, slides, and the unforgiving glare of the microscope. My neck ached, my eyes burned, but I pushed through, driven by a stubborn certainty that something was still hiding. I was sifting through the victim's stomach contents, a grim task, but one that often provided a precise snapshot of their last moments. The larger elements, digested remnants of bog flora, fragments of insect chitin, were exactly what I'd expect from someone who'd spent time in a peatland environment. But I wasn't looking for the obvious. I adjusted the focus, my thumb sore from the fine-tuning knob. The field of view swam with microscopic detritus, fungal spores, diatoms, amorphous organic particles. Then a flicker, a tiny, almost crystalline glint catching the harsh light of the microscope. My breath hitched. I leaned closer, my gaze locked on the anomaly. It wasn't organic. It wasn't a natural mineral found in this particular bog. It was a cluster of minuscule angular particles, translucent and shimmering with an almost metallic sheen. They looked like crushed glass, but the light refracted differently. I zoomed in further, pushing the magnification to its absolute limit. The particles resolved into distinct, six-sided prisms, silicate, but not just any silicate. This was a very specific form with trace elements that suggested an industrial origin, not a natural geological deposit. It was a fingerprint, clear and undeniable, left by something utterly out of place in an ancient bog. My mind raced. How could this be here? The victim, if the staging was true, had been placed in the bog after death. This silicate, therefore, had to be introduced just prior to the placement, or had been ingested shortly before the victim's demise. Either way, it connected the victim to a location, a place that wasn't the bog itself. I carefully isolated a sample, transferring it to a mass spectrometer. The results confirmed my visual identification, a rare crystalline silicate, rich in specific trace metals that pointed to a unique geological formation. A formation not found anywhere near the bog where the body was discovered. This particular silicate was known to occur in only one other area in the region, miles to the north, where the soil was unusually rich in a unique, almost artisanal clay. My fingers flew across the keyboard, a sudden surge of adrenaline chasing away the fatigue. I dove into geological databases, cross-referencing mineral compositions, soil maps, anything I could get my hands on. Then historical land deeds. It was tedious, slow work, but I refused to give up. The unique clay deposits, the specific silicate, they were a beacon. And there it was, a name, Blackwood Corporation. The land where this specific silicate was abundant, the area known for its distinct clay, had been under the continuous ownership of the Blackwood Corporation for over a century. Blackwood wasn't just some local business. It was a monolithic entity, a conglomerate with tentacles reaching into every aspect of the regional economy: agriculture, timber, land development, even historical preservation projects. They were notoriously private, their operations shrouded in a veil of corporate discretion. I stared at the screen, the name glowing back at me in the sterile blue light. The implication hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just a cunning individual I was after anymore. This was something far larger, far more entrenched. I called the detective, my voice tighter than I liked, the tremor barely suppressed. "I found something," I replied, skipping pleasantries. "Something big." I laid out the details, the microscopic particles, the specific silicate, the geological maps, the land deeds, the irrefutable link to Blackwood Corporation. The silence stretched, heavy and profound. Blackwood Corporation, they finally said, the name a heavy stone in the quiet room. It's their land, their clay deposits. The victim was exposed to it somehow just before death. The quiet in their voice, the almost imperceptible hesitation, spoke volumes. It wasn't disbelief. It was a different kind of recognition. A recognition of power, of influence, of a force that could make problems disappear. I could almost hear the gears turning in their head, the weight of what I'd just uncovered settling on their shoulders. "This changes things," the detective finally said, their voice regaining some of its steel, with an underlying current of caution. "This changes everything." I looked around the lab at the gleaming chrome, the spotless surfaces, the controlled environment. It suddenly felt less like a sanctuary of truth and more like a glass cage. The ghosts of my own history, the echoes of a personal tragedy where powerful forces had obscured truth, stirred within me. This wasn't just about justice for a nameless victim anymore. This was about confronting a Goliath. And I knew with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified me that Goliath would fight back. The game had just begun, and the stakes had escalated beyond anything I could have imagined. The air in the state-of-the-art forensic center, everything sterile and cold, felt thinner than usual. Every surface gleamed, reflecting the harsh overhead lights, stripping away any warmth, any softness. It was a place designed for objective truth, yet lately it felt like a stage for elaborate deceptions. I was back in the lab, hunched over a microscopic slide, examining a sliver of the ancient bog material, looking for anything that screamed anomaly louder than the last. My focus narrowed to a cluster of pollen grains, their forms distinct, not quite matching the expected ancient flora. A shadow fell across my bench. I didn't need to look up to know it was the senior analyst, a man whose presence usually brought a sense of calm authority. Today, it felt like judgment. "Reid," his voice was smooth, almost too smooth. "A word if I have a moment," I sighed, setting down the tweezers. "Of course." He gestured towards his office, a glass-walled cube that offered no privacy, only visibility. Inside, the sterile theme continued, devoid of personal touches. He sat behind a large, empty desk, hands folded. I remained standing, leaning against the door frame. "I've been quite thorough with this bog discovery," he began, a faint smile playing on his lips that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Exceedingly so. The historical community is quite excited, as I can imagine." I nodded, waiting for the but. "However," he continued, leaning forward slightly, "there's a growing sentiment that perhaps we're overcomplicating things. The initial assessment was clear, an ancient find, a remarkable one. We wouldn't want to muddy the waters, would we, especially with certain interested parties?" My stomach tightened. Muddy the waters. The evidence points to a more recent origin, at least in part. The carbon dating, the microfractures, the specific pollen signatures. He raised a hand, cutting me off gently. "Details, Reid. Important details, yes. But sometimes the simplest explanation is the correct one. A unique preservation, perhaps, or dare I say, an overzealous interpretation fueled by, well, a desire for a more sensational narrative." His gaze was steady, unwavering. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a directive. A polite, institutional nudge to fall in line, to stop digging. It felt exactly like the pressure I remembered from years ago, the subtle but firm hand of power trying to guide the narrative away from inconvenient truths. I felt a flicker of doubt. There was I seeing patterns where none existed. There was my past trauma clouding my judgment, making me paranoid. "My role is to follow the evidence, not to craft narratives," I stated, my voice level despite the tremor in my gut. He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Of course, Reid. And I do it exceptionally well. Just be mindful of the bigger picture. This facility, our funding, our reputation. These things are delicate. We wouldn't want to be perceived as alarmist." He paused, then added, "There are other, more pressing cases that require my unique expertise. Perhaps we can start transitioning to the new cold case files next week." It was a soft demotion, a sidelining, a clear message that my current path was unacceptable. Back at my workstation, the sterile environment suddenly felt suffocating. I pulled up the digitized images of the victim's hand, specifically the unique, almost imperceptible discoloration beneath the nail bed I'd noted. It was a detail I'd flagged for further analysis, a potential trace of a modern substance. I'd taken a micro sample, carefully labeled and logged it. My fingers found the slot, then the small, clear vial. It was there. Good. I pulled it out, double-checking the label. My handwriting, my date, my case number. But as I held it up to the light, something felt off. The sample itself. It was smaller than I remembered, almost as if a portion had been removed, and the color. I distinctly recalled a faint, almost translucent blue tint. This sample was entirely clear. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't my past bleeding into the present. This was real. Someone had tampered with my evidence. Not just moved it, not just mislabeled it, they had altered it, replaced it, or extracted from it. They were actively trying to erase the very clues I was uncovering. Wait, that doesn't add up, I murmured, my voice barely audible in the vast, quiet space. The missing blue tint, the reduced volume, it was too precise to be an accident. Someone knew exactly what I was looking for. My mind raced. Who had access? When? The logbooks were meticulous, but a determined individual could bypass protocols. This wasn't just institutional pressure now. This was sabotage. This was a direct threat to the integrity of my work, and by extension to me. I spent the next hour rechecking every sample, every photographic record, every digital scan related to the bog body. Nothing else was overtly missing, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Every detail I'd taken for granted now felt suspect. Had other things been subtly altered in ways I hadn't yet noticed? Later that evening, long after the senior analyst and most of the other colleagues had left, I was still there, hunched over my bench, reviewing old notes. An unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. Reid, a voice, distorted and low, spoke from the other end. It was clearly disguised, electronically modified. I read, getting too close. Some things are best left buried for everyone's sake. The line went dead. No warning, no preamble. My hand trembled as I lowered the phone. The sterile environment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a spotlight, exposing me, making me vulnerable. The echoes of my personal tragedy, the memory of truth being suppressed by powerful, faceless forces, roared to life. This wasn't just a case anymore. This was a battle, and I was in it alone. And suddenly, the determination to uncover the truth, no matter the cost, solidified within me. They wanted me to back down. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The line went dead. Just a chilling, direct threat. My hand trembled as I lowered the phone, the cold plastic feeling alien against my clammy skin. The sterile environment, once a sanctuary of logic and reason, now felt like a spotlight, exposing me, making me vulnerable. The echoes of my personal tragedy, the memory of truth being suppressed by powerful forces, clawed at the edges of my composure. They knew. They weren't just watching, they were warning. And that warning, delivered in a voice devoid of emotion, was a promise. For a moment, a wave of nausea washed over me. Doubt, a venomous serpent, began to coil around my resolve. There was I chasing ghosts. The historical community had dismissed my theories. The detective had been openly skeptical. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was wrong. But then the tremor in my hand stilled. No, I wasn't wrong. The anomalies were too precise, too deliberate. The phone call wasn't a random act of intimidation. It was confirmation. I was closer than I'd realized, to something they desperately wanted to keep buried. And if it connected to my past, to the way powerful interests had suffocated justice before, then I would tear down every wall they built. The ancient bog samples, the victims' preserved tissues, the reconstructed clothing fibers they lay under microscopes and in sealed containers, silent witnesses. I needed to go back. Not to the obvious, not to the macro, but to the infinitesimal. My focus narrowed to the victims' clothing, the carefully woven fibers that had been presented as ancient textile. I had noted a peculiar, almost metallic sheen in certain strands, an observation I'd initially attributed to mineral deposits from the bog's unique chemistry. I pulled the slide containing a cross-section of the fabric from its labeled slot and repositioned it under the electron microscope. The high-magnification image resolved into a dizzying landscape of interwoven threads, each filament a miniature landscape of its own. I zoomed in, hunting for that peculiar sheen. There it was, glinting like microscopic shards of glass embedded within the organic fibers. These weren't mineral deposits. They were too uniform, too angular. My gut clenched. I recalibrated the microscope, adjusting the light source, enhancing the contrast. Under the higher resolution, the shards resolved into distinct crystalline structures, unlike anything I'd ever seen naturally occurring in bog environments, ancient or modern. They were synthetic. My fingers flew across the control panel, initiating a microspectroscopy analysis. The machine whirred softly, a focused beam of electrons bombarding the tiny crystals. The screen flickered, then began to display a complex graph of elemental composition. My eyes scanned the peaks. Iron, yes, but also a significant spike of an element that shouldn't be there, not in those concentrations and certainly not in this form. A heavy metal. Not just any heavy metal, but a specific compound, one I recognized from environmental toxicology reports. A byproduct of industrial processing. This wasn't just a modern murder staged to look ancient. It was a modern murder using the bog as both a grave and a deliberate misdirection, and the victim was carrying the evidence. These particles, embedded in the fibers of the ancient clothing, indicated exposure to a specific industrial pollutant. But why? I accessed the Forensic Center's vast digital archives, cross-referencing the chemical signature with known industrial sites in the region. The search results were immediate and damning. The compound was a signature pollutant from a defunct chemical processing plant that had operated for decades, just a few miles from the bog. The plant had been implicated in a massive environmental scandal years ago, accused of illegal dumping and severe contamination of the local water table and soil. The case had been settled out of court, sealed, and largely forgotten, painted over by a corporate rebranding and a cleanup that locals had always claimed was a sham. A new search, land deeds and historical ownership records for the bog and surrounding areas. My fingers trembled again, but this time from a surge of adrenaline, not fear. The bog itself, along with vast tracts of the surrounding wetlands, had been owned by a single family for generations. Then, about 50 years ago, coinciding with the peak operational years of the chemical plant, a significant portion of that land, including the bog, had been controversially acquired by a subsidiary of the very corporation that owned the polluting plant. The sale had been under peculiar circumstances, shrouded in legal battles and allegations of coercion. And then it clicked. The intergenerational secrets, the corporate greed, the environmental cover-up. The victim, the bog man, wasn't just a random individual. What if this person was connected to that original family? What if they had discovered renewed evidence of the contamination, or were trying to expose the inadequacy of the cleanup? What if they were fighting to reclaim their ancestral land that was now a toxic wasteland? The subtle anomalies I'd found on the body, the peculiar preservation fluid, the faint, almost imperceptible discoloration of the deeper tissues suddenly made sense. The ancient staging wasn't just to hide a modern murder. It was to distract from the bog's true, contaminated nature. To have an ancient body emerge from a supposedly pristine natural wonder would draw archaeological attention, not environmental scrutiny. The killer wasn't just hiding a body. They were hiding a crime against the land itself, and generations of deceit. And they were dumped in the very bog they might have been fighting to protect. A final, cruel irony. My personal tragedy had stemmed from a similar web of corporate power and suppressed truth, the details of which still haunted my sleep. I had seen how easily evidence could be dismissed, how quickly inconvenient truths could be buried under layers of official narratives and legal maneuvering. This wasn't just a similar fate for the victim. It was the same mechanism of injustice. I had uncovered it all. The full, horrifying extent of the conspiracy. It wasn't just a local dispute or a random act of violence. It was a meticulously planned cover-up spanning decades, involving powerful corporate interests and likely several generations of complicit individuals. And I, Reid, had just pulled back the curtain. The threat on the phone wasn't just a warning. It was a desperate, final attempt to keep me from this exact moment. My breath hitched. I had the truth. But now, what did I do with it? I was standing on the precipice, holding a truth that could shatter reputations, bring down empires, and expose a legacy of environmental devastation. And the people who had gone to such lengths to bury it, the people who had just threatened my life, knew I had it. The sterile air of the forensic center suddenly felt suffocating. There was no turning back. The game had just changed, and I was now deeply, irrevocably in it. The line went dead. My breath hitched. They knew. They knew I was close, but how close? And how did they know I was here in this specific lab at this precise moment? I'd been meticulous, keeping my theories close, sharing only fragments with the detective, and even then couching them in academic terms. No one else should have known I was piecing together the modern anomalies, the subtle signs of a staged death. I walked to the observation window, looking out at the city lights, a distant, indifferent sprawl. My reflection stared back, wide-eyed, a stranger. And then a thought like a shard of ice in my gut. Why call? If they were truly powerful, truly ruthless, why not simply act? Why the warning unless? Unless it wasn't just a warning, unless it was a lure. My mind raced back through the fragments, the inconsistencies. The victim's unique dental work, not easily dismissed as ancient erosion. The trace plastics I'd found embedded deep in the bog fibers, near where the body was unearthed, which the archaeological team had dismissed as modern contamination. And the call itself. The voice calm, almost bored, yet utterly confident. It was too polished, too theatrical. I remembered the detective's exasperation earlier, his insistence on sticking to the archaeological find narrative. He'd shown me a corporate dossier, a thick file detailing land acquisition around the bog, a contentious struggle between a venerable, old-money family and local landowners. The family, the dossier claimed, had eventually secured the rights to the vast tract of peatland, citing plans for ecological preservation. Preservation that seemed to involve draining parts of it for research. That was it. The land. The bog wasn't just a burial site, it was a property. The staged ancient body, a macabre prop, but why? To deter further excavation. To sanctify the land, making it untouchable. Suddenly, a name surfaced in my memory from the dossier. A name the detective had casually mentioned. A name attached to the corporate entity that now owned the bog. The Sterling Group. A name I'd seen before, years ago, in the aftermath of my own family's tragedy. A construction project, a land dispute, a wrongful death suit that had been buried under legal maneuvers and out-of-court settlements. The details had always been hazy, obscured by grief and legal jargon, but the name Sterling had always been a bitter echo. My hands clenched into fists. It couldn't be a coincidence. My personal tragedy, the bog victim's fate, corporate greed, it was all connected. This wasn't just about preserving land, it was about preserving a secret. An intergenerational secret, perhaps, something so rotten it required a death, then a second and a third to keep it buried. Not to the bog itself, not yet, but to the source. The corporate offices, or rather, where the old money really lived. The dossier had mentioned a private estate, an old mill converted into a private residence, overlooking the newly acquired lands. It was a long shot, a dangerous one, but the phone call had made it clear. They wanted me to come to them, and I was done playing by their rules. My old sedan ate up the miles, the hum of the engine a counterpoint to the frantic beat of my own heart. It was an abandoned textile mill, repurposed into a grand, if imposing, private residence. The detective's dossier had a satellite image, showing the main building flanked by what looked like old loading docks and a vast, empty warehouse. I parked a quarter-mile down a gravel track, plunging into the dense woods that bordered the property. The air grew heavy, damp with the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves. My breathing was loud in the quiet night, my own footsteps crunching on fallen twigs. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a branch made me flinch. This was no sterile lab, this was their territory. I crept through a gap in a broken wire fence, emerging behind the massive, silent warehouse. Its windows, high and grimy, reflected the sliver of moon like dead eyes. A faint light glowed from a single window in the main residence, far across a vast, overgrown courtyard. I had to get inside. The warehouse door, a rusty behemoth of corrugated metal, was secured with a heavy chain and padlock. But years of neglect had warped the frame, leaving a gap at the bottom, just wide enough for me to squeeze through if I contorted myself. I took a deep breath, tasted the metallic tang of old industrial dust, and forced my way in. The interior was a cavernous space, filled with the ghosts of industry. High ceilings disappeared into gloom. Dust motes danced in the sparse moonlight filtering through the grimy skylights. It was the same voice from the phone call. I froze, my blood turning to ice. I hadn't heard a sound. It was the patriarch of the Sterling family, the elderly gentleman whose photograph had been in the dossier, the face of Sterling Group. He was accompanied by two younger men built like brick walls, flanking him silently. They weren't wearing suits. They were wearing work gloves. A little out of my element, aren't I? The patriarch continued, a faint smile playing on his lips. This isn't my clean, predictable laboratory, is it? My mind scrambled, trying to find an escape, a weapon, anything, but I had nothing, just my intellect and a desperation to know the truth. I called me, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I wanted me to come. Indeed, I've proven, persistent, a fly in the ointment. We appreciate persistence in its own way. But now it's time to understand. He gestured around the vast space with an open hand. This was once the heart of our family's fortune. Textiles employed half the county, but times change, and sometimes to keep moving forward certain, he held a shovel. The other produced a coil of rope from a bag slung over his shoulder, a message to keep people away from the land. The bog wasn't just for burying, it was for preserving, a perfect time capsule. I see the original incident occurred decades ago. A minor industrial mishap, toxic runoff, a few unfortunate deaths. My father handled it, buried the evidence literally in the deepest part of the bog where the peat acid would do its work. My breath caught. My family, my uncle, he worked on a construction site near one of my old chemical plants. He vanished. They said it was an accident, fell into a deep excavation pit, but the body was never found. The words tumbled out, a raw wound finally exposed. The patriarch's eyes flickered, momentary recognition. Ah yes, the O'Malley incident. Unfortunate, he was getting too close to what he shouldn't have seen. He was a good man, my uncle, too curious. He knew about the old waste, the cover-up. We couldn't risk him talking, so we gave him a proper burial, a very, very deep one, in the bog. He paused, letting the implication sink in. The recent discovery was problematic, an unforeseen consequence of our ecological preservation efforts, draining the land. We needed to ensure no one dug too deep. So we created a new ancient find, a diversion, a beautiful, tragic archaeological marvel to distract from the true horror beneath. The pieces clicked into place, a horrifying mosaic. My family's tragedy, the bog victim, the corporate secrets, all intertwined. And why them? A local agitator, the patriarch replied, his voice devoid of remorse. Opposed to our land development. He threatened to expose old documents, old rumors. He became inconvenient, so we staged his disappearance, then his discovery, a perfect mimicry of an ancient find to ensure the bog remained a protected site, a historical treasure off-limits to further scrutiny. You, Reid, nearly ruined everything. He took another step closer, the younger men fanning out. But now you understand, and now you too will become part of the bog's enduring mystery. I backed away, my eyes darting, searching. My mind raced not for escape but for leverage. They had me, but I had the truth. And maybe, just maybe, I could still use it. You won't get away with it, I answered, my voice trembling but firm. I've told the detective everything, he knows. A lie, a desperate, flimsy lie. The patriarch chuckled, a dry, rasping sound that echoed in the vast space. Do you truly believe that? You, the reclusive academic with your wild theories. He thinks you're eccentric, Reid. Brilliant, perhaps, but ultimately a dreamer. No, no one knows, and soon no one will even remember your name. The man with the shovel took another step, raising the tool slightly. This was it, the climax, and I was alone. The shovel hovered, a dark silhouette against the dim light, its edge glinting with a malevolent promise. I braced myself, a cold dread seeping through my chest, but before the swing could connect, a thunderous crash erupted from the far side of the abandoned factory, blurred by speed and the poor light, hurtled past me, tackling the man with the shovel to the grimy concrete floor. It was the detective. His arrival was less a rescue and more a controlled detonation, a whirlwind of fists and grunts. I scrambled back, my legs unsteady, watching the struggle unfold. Other figures poured in through the newly breached entrance, uniformed officers, their flashlights cutting through the gloom like eager blades. The man with the shovel, surprisingly strong, fought with a desperate ferocity, but he was quickly overwhelmed, pinned down, and cuffed. He looked at me, his gaze unreadable in the fractured light. "You all right, Reid?" He grunted, not waiting for an answer as he barked orders to the officers. I just nodded, my voice caught somewhere in my throat, my hands trembling. Hours later, the world felt muted, seen through a pane of thick, soundproof glass. The gleaming surfaces, the hushed efficiency of the staff, the hum of unseen machinery, it was a stark contrast to the grime and chaos of the abandoned factory. A colleague, a quiet specialist in trace evidence, had offered me a mug of lukewarm herbal tea, which I cradled for the warmth rather than the taste. My hands still had a faint tremor. The initial debriefing had been a blur of questions and fragmented answers. The details of the chase, the surveillance that had led the detective to the factory, the sheer luck of his timing, it all swam around me half-heard. The man with the shovel, a disgruntled former employee of the corporate entity that stood to gain from the bogland, had been apprehended. He hadn't acted alone, of course. The financial backer, the corporate executive whose ambition had fueled the entire deception, was also in custody. Even the historian, whose initial authentication had lent the scheme credibility, was being questioned, his reputation in tatters. "They're calling it the Bog imposter case," the colleague said, leaning against a workbench, his voice low. "The news is everywhere. Apparently the public is shocked." Shocked was an understatement. The story had exploded. The ancient, perfectly preserved bog body was now revealed as a modern murder victim, meticulously staged to resemble an archaeological marvel. The intricate web of corporate greed, land deals, and intergenerational secrets all tumbling out into the public sphere. The initial awe and wonder had curdled into outrage. I could almost feel the collective gasp of disbelief radiating from every screen and headline. I thought about the victim, the young woman whose life had been so cruelly taken, then so callously exploited. Her real name was finally being circulated, her story finally being told, not as a relic of the past, but as a casualty of the present. It was a small victory, but it felt immense. A sense of weariness, deeper than any physical exhaustion, settled over me. My body ached, my head throbbed, and yet my mind refused to quiet. I kept replaying the confrontation, the glint of the shovel, the detective's sudden arrival. Had I been too reckless? Had I pushed too hard, too fast? A tiny tremor of doubt ran through me. Perhaps I had become so consumed by the puzzle, so desperate for answers, that I had overlooked my own safety or even the subtle warnings that might have been there. It was a discomforting thought, a flaw in my own meticulous process. The detective, his face etched with fatigue and a fresh bruise blooming on his cheekbone, found me shortly after. "The corporate executive isn't talking much yet," he responded, accepting a fresh mug of tea from my colleague. "But the man with the shovel, he's giving us a lot. Says the historian was more than just negligent. Knew exactly what he was doing, helped with the aging process, the fake artifacts." "I suspected as much," I murmured, recalling the historian's defensive posturing, the almost too eager confirmation of the find's antiquity. The details were too perfect, the narrative too clean. It always felt like an elaborate performance of a lifetime, nearly cost you yours. the detective said, his gaze sharp. He paused, then continued. He also mentioned something. A name. A local landowner, Old Money. Apparently, he was involved in some earlier land disputes with the corporate executive and was trying to subtly sabotage the deal. He tipped off the man with the shovel about the plans, hoping to expose the executive's shady dealings before the ancient find could cement the land grab. I frowned. So the local landowner wasn't part of the murder, was using the discovery of the fake find to his own advantage. That was a new layer. Another conspirator, albeit one with a different motive, playing a dangerous game. It made sense in a twisted way. Everyone had been using the bog, using the victim for their own ends. That's what it sounds like, the detective confirmed. He claims he didn't know about the murder, just the plan to stage a fake ancient discovery. Wanted to expose the executive as a fraud, not a murderer. He sighed, running a hand over his face. One messy pile of secrets, Reid, but we're untangling it thanks to you. The compliment felt heavy, almost too heavy. The puzzle was largely solved, the pieces falling into their grim places. But even with the arrests, even with the revelations, a faint, persistent hum of unease lingered. The man with the shovel's desperation, the way he'd almost welcomed the confrontation, felt off. Like there was still a missing piece, a final, crucial motive that hadn't quite clicked into place. Or perhaps it was just the exhaustion talking. The silence in the state-of-the-art forensic center, everything sterile and cold, felt like a physical pressure. It was a different kind of quiet than the bog, less ancient and profound, more engineered and clinical. My fingers traced the edges of a printed photograph on the stainless steel table, a close-up of the victim's left femur. The microscopic striations I'd identified highlighted in stark red. The image was a testament to the meticulous deception, a ghost of a tool mark that screamed modern intervention where only millennia should have spoken. The previous weeks had been a blur of reports, depositions, and endless consultations with the prosecuting advocate. The initial relief of the arrests, the sense of a puzzle finally locked into place, hadn't lasted. Instead, it had curdled into a cold, heavy weight. A victory, yes, but one carved from profound loss, both the victim's and, in a way, my own. The echoes of my past, the tragedy that had shaped my reclusive life, had grown louder with each detail uncovered. I still saw the bog sometimes in the periphery of my vision, the peat-stained face of the unearthed body staring up at me, silent and accusing. That first faint whiff of a preservative, subtly different from natural bog acids, had been the thread. My testimony was the final piece, the bridge between the silent earth and the justice system. The weight of it pressed down not just the scientific accuracy but the human cost. I cleared my throat, the sound sharp in the quiet room. A colleague, a younger forensic technician with earnest eyes, walked in carrying a steaming mug. Almost time, Reid. The advocate wants a quick run-through on the tool marks again. I nodded, pushing the photograph aside. Ready. Or as ready as I could ever be to dissect a meticulously planned murder for public consumption. I had spent countless hours in this very lab under these unforgiving fluorescent lights, peeling back layers of deception. Each fiber, each trace element, each subtle skeletal anomaly had been a clue, leading me from the bog's ancient embrace to a modern, corporate conspiracy. The technician set the mug down. You did good, Reid. They wouldn't have gotten this far without you. The compliment felt like a thin balm on a deep burn, just doing my job. But it was more than that. It was an obligation, a debt I felt to the victim, to the forgotten, to the silent. In the ensuing hours, I walked the prosecuting advocate through my findings one last time. We stood before a large monitor displaying 3D reconstructions of the burial site, cross-sections of bone, magnified images of the unusual preservation agents. I explained how the perpetrators had used a specific, commercially available resin, diluted and applied in layers, to mimic the natural preserving effects of the bog. This wasn't just a haphazard burial. It was an elaborate artifice, designed to delay discovery and misdirect any future investigation into the distant past. The killer hadn't just murdered, they had attempted to erase the very idea of a modern crime. And the specific identification of the resin, the advocate pressed, his voice sharp, preparing for the cross-examination he knew was coming. We traced its unique molecular signature. I explained, gesturing to a spectral analysis graph. It's a polymer used primarily in certain industrial applications, specifically for coating archaeological finds to prevent decay during transport or exhibition. A cruel irony given its use here. This was the reveal, the final, undeniable proof of modern intervention, beyond any doubt. The sheer audacity of using a tool meant to preserve history to falsify a death was breathtaking in its callousness. Later, in the controlled chaos of the courthouse, I presented my evidence. The courtroom was a blur of faces: the judge, the defense counsel, the jury, and in the gallery, the stoic faces of the victim's family. I saw the mother, her eyes fixed on me, a desperate hope mingled with profound grief. My voice, though calm and measured, resonated with the weight of scientific truth and the underlying sorrow of the story it told. I spoke of the victim's last moments, pieced together from the minute fractures in the ribs, the precise angle of the blow to the head, the careful, almost ritualistic placement in the peat. It was a narrative of violence, yes, but also of a life stolen and a truth almost buried forever. As I stepped down, a profound exhaustion settled over me. The advocate gave a brief, appreciative nod. I avoided eye contact with the defense, whose attempts to discredit my findings had felt like pinpricks against a granite wall. My gaze drifted to the victim's family again. The mother offered a small, almost imperceptible nod back. It wasn't a smile, couldn't be, but it was a recognition, a fragile bridge built over a chasm of sorrow. In that moment, I felt a flicker of something akin to peace, knowing that my work had perhaps brought them a sliver of understanding, a foundation for closure. The case, with its eerie echoes of my own past the sudden, inexplicable loss, the feeling of being gaslit by circumstances had forced me to revisit old wounds. I'd seen the victim's struggle mirrored in my own grief, the desire to find truth in the face of obfuscation. I walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. The world outside felt distant, yet connected. For so long, I had let the past define me, letting the trauma fester in isolation. But this case, this journey into another's meticulously hidden demise, had shown me something. The victim hadn't just been a casualty. They had been a fighter, their body telling a story of defiance even in death. And in deciphering that story, I had found a quiet strength I hadn't realized I possessed. The road to healing was long, I knew. The scars wouldn't vanish. But for the first time in a very long time, I felt a tentative step forward. The puzzle was solved, yes, but the pieces of my own life, shattered for so long, were beginning, ever so slowly, to knit themselves back together. I still had work to do always, but perhaps now I could do it with less burden and a little more light. My determination, honed by years of solitude and precise observation, now felt tempered with a fragile, burgeoning sense of personal renewal. The fluorescent lights of the state-of-the-art forensic center, everything sterile and cold, hummed a familiar, almost comforting drone above me. My gaze drifted across the polished stainless steel of the lab bench, past the neatly organized trays of instruments to the final, compiled report. It wasn't just a document. It was the culmination of weeks spent peeling back layers of deception, a meticulous autopsy of a carefully constructed lie. I had pushed the photograph aside weeks ago, a snapshot of the unearthed bog body, beautiful and eerie in its preservation. Now, the image in my mind was far less romantic. It was a reconstruction, a detailed anatomical drawing of a modern man, not an ancient relic, his life stolen and then meticulously, cruelly buried in a performance piece designed to fool the ages. The detective had been skeptical initially. The historical community downright hostile. They saw a miracle, an archaeological wonder. I saw a crime scene. I remembered the early days, the quiet doubts that gnawed at me, the tiny anomalies that whispered of a different truth, the subtle striations on a bone fragment, inconsistent with centuries of anaerobic decay, the almost imperceptible traces of a synthetic polymer, a thread finer than any spider silk, woven into the fabric of the victim's clothing, a fabric that, under a powerful electron microscope, revealed its machine-woven origins, not hand-spun. The killer, a land developer with a taste for the dramatic and a family history steeped in territorial disputes, had inherited a parcel of bog land. Land he couldn't develop because of its protected status as a site of potential archaeological significance. That, and a bitter, generations-old feud with the victim's family over water rights, a feud that had festered beneath the surface like the peat itself. The discovery of an ancient body, particularly one that appeared to be an ancestor of the victim's family, would solidify the land's protected status, a final, spiteful victory against the current generation. But the developer had seen an opportunity, a way to settle both scores. I'd worked backward from the modern anomalies to the motive. The killer hadn't wanted the land preserved. They'd wanted it tainted with a false history to inflict a different kind of wound. The victim was not just a symbol. He was a very real, very inconvenient thorn in the developer's side, a vocal opponent of a proposed project. It wasn't about protecting the bog. It was about destroying a lineage, humiliating a rival. The elaborate staging, the careful selection of the bog site, the precise burial technique mimicking ancient finds, the subtle additions of fabricated artifacts was not for archaeology, but for vengeance. The tension in the lab had been a constant companion, a taut wire stretched between my observations and the prevailing narratives. My colleagues, initially perplexed, had slowly come around, swayed by the irrefutable data. Each fiber, each trace element, each minute detail I'd painstakingly documented had built an unassailable case. The synthetic polymer traced to a specialized fishing line, not ancient weaving. The pollen samples cross-referenced with modern agricultural practices, not untouched wilderness. The isotopes in the victim's teeth, indicating a diet consistent with contemporary food sources, not the sparse fare of distant ancestors. It was a slow, agonizing process of dismantling a masterpiece of malice. And with each piece I dismantled, a part of my own history resonated. The victim's quiet defiance, his unwavering stand against a powerful adversary, mirrored a past I rarely allowed myself to revisit. My own personal tragedy, the one that had drawn me into this particular field, had been born of a similar clash of wills, a quiet life snuffed out by the careless ambition of others. For so long, I had seen myself as merely an interpreter of the dead, a dispassionate cataloger of their final moments. But this case had been different. It felt like an act of personal reclamation, a quiet battle fought on behalf of someone who could no longer fight for themselves. The final reveal had come in the form of a forensic geological analysis, matching the specific peat composition adhering to the victim's clothes with a disturbed section of the developer's property, a section where a recent, unauthorized excavation had taken place. The detective had closed the case that afternoon, the evidence overwhelming. The developer, cornered by facts, had eventually cracked, admitting to the elaborate deception, the twisted satisfaction of his art. Now, sitting here, the hum of the lab was no longer just a sound. The scars from my own past remained, etched deep, but the raw edges felt softer. This case hadn't healed them, but it had given them context. I had faced the cunning of a killer, the skepticism of institutions, and the ghosts of my own history, and I had prevailed, not with fanfare, but with the quiet triumph of truth. I picked up the report, its pages cool beneath my fingertips. The weight of it was substantial, not just paper, but the sum of a life, a death, and the relentless pursuit of understanding. My perspective on life and death hadn't radically altered, but it had deepened. Death wasn't just an end. It was often a story waiting to be told, a puzzle waiting for its solution. And I was the one who listened, who pieced together the fragments, who gave voice to the voiceless. But it was my path. I closed the report, a quiet sense of acceptance settling over me. The work was done for now.